I am on. I am on. Is everybody here okay? Yeah? Good. I was just remembering the last time I was here, which I think was September 2017, I made an announcement that if anybody in the audience happened to know the late publisher and editor and personality in this part of the world, Bun OShea, they should sign up, and I would be in touch with them because I was doing research about Bun OShea, who is known familiarly to everybody who knew him as Bun. Well, the chapter got written, the book got published, and it's here. And I'll be happy to make it available for purchase and sign copies and all that. So considering that this one chapter on Bernard and Sheila OShea takes place around the St. Albans area, there's mainly in Swanton, I thought I would concentrate on talking about that chapter today, but also give you an overview of the book. It's called, as you can see, Red Scare in the Green Mountains, Vermont in the McCarthy Era, 1946 to 1960. Over the years, I've noticed that people tend to use those two terms interchangeably, the McCarthy Era and the Red Scare. And I've come to much more appreciate the term Red Scare. It's got a vivid quality, it's got color, it's not neutral, and it also, it takes the emphasis off Senator McCarthy himself. Popular conception is that Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin started this thing and other people jumped on his bandwagon, creating a lot of fear and paranoia during the 50s. But the truth is closer to the fact that the bandwagon was already in full motion and McCarthy jumped on it and became the leading character. This is his famous speech that propelled him onto the national stage in February 1950. I have here in my hand the names of 205 communists in the State Department. The number changed at least 4 times after that, but the damage was done. So McCarthy's time on the national stage was relatively short, 1950 to 1954. So that's why I also prefer the term Red Scare, because as a historian friend of mine said, as long as there have been communists, there have been anti-communists and fear of communism. So I started my book in 1946 as the starting point with the collapse of the alliance between our country and the Soviet Union that led in many ways to the Red Scare. My own interest in this topic really had to start with my parents. This is a picture taken of them. I'm dating it to the late 1930s. They were both children of Eastern European immigrants, grew up in New York City, and went into teaching. And in my father's case, he really wanted to be an architect, but unfortunately, there were quotas about how many Jews could go to architecture school in many colleges. They were very affected by the Red Scare. My father actually lost his job because of it. My mother had managed to keep hers. That's a long story, which I go into in the book. But like many people of their generation and background, they were really drawn to social justice issues. And one of the many options for people on the left in the 1930s who were upset about the inequality that they saw all around them during the Depression One of the many options was the Communist Party. Now, the Communist Party became kind of a boogeyman term over the years, but for my parents, it was just part of the activism of the times. If you were interested in union organizing, if you were interested in racial justice issues, the Communist Party had a lot of appeal to them and people like them. Disillusionment came much later, but as the novelist Philip Roth said, talking about his own favorite English teacher who lost his job in Newark, New Jersey, he said the whole generation was impaled on their moment in history. And what he meant by that was that the meaning I take, my parents, like others, joined organizations, went on protest marches, signed petitions, and the furthest thing from their mind was that in 20 years they were going to get called before some committee and saying, did you join this organization? Did you go on this march, etc.? And by the way, tell us who else was there with you. My parents were born, my father in 1911, my mother in 1914. Yeah, we're of an era. So anyway, I didn't know any of this while it was happening. I was just a little kid. But when I became a teenager, and this does connect with movies, which is my big interest, because I started getting very interested in old Hollywood movies when I was a teenager and learned about this thing called the Hollywood blacklist that affected the industry in roughly these years. And I said, I think my parents went through something like that, judging from what I had eavesdropped on their conversations. Well, they were very open with me about what they went through. And I realized for the first time how this era really affected my family and the decisions that they made as a family. So I got to Vermont in 1970, fresh out of college, with very little, I didn't know, I had never heard the name Phil Hoff before. My perception was that Vermont was a solidly Republican state. I only learned afterwards in getting here that Republicanism took on many different shades and forms. 1970, when I moved up here, was also the first year that Bernie Sanders made his first statewide run on the Liberty Union. So Vermont definitely was changing. But I always kept this in my mind. I wonder what happened here during those years. And in the mid-'80s, I met two other people who shared my interest. One is still living in Montpelier, Michael Sherman, who is the director of the Vermont Historical Society, and the late Professor Richard Hathaway, who taught for many years at Goddard College and Vermont College. And the three of us organized a weekend-long conference. And what did happen during that time? And being 1988, a lot of the people who took part in the events of that era were still around and could come and talk to us. So when the conference was a big success, but I always felt that we had barely scratched the surface. And someday when I have this thing called free time, I would go and delve back into it, and hence the writing of this book. And I realized that I already had the core of the book from what the panels at the conference, which were all recorded and are at the Vermont Historical Society. So very briefly, some of the chapters I have in my book that came out of the conference. Vermont farmer cites Fifth Amendment when questioned on red status. I remember coming across this in the library. I was going through the Rutland Herald's day by day for the entire year of 1954. I'll get to that in a minute, but I came across this very intriguing headline, and I said, wow, I wonder if that Vermont farmer is still alive, and maybe if he is, he'll come to our conference. Well, when I read the second paragraph, I realized that the Vermont farmer who had since become much more well-known than for just being a Vermont farmer, it was William Hinton, who is an internationally known expert on the Chinese Communist Revolution. And in fact, he was called to testify after having witnessed the takeover of China by the communists. He lived there for 6 years while the communists had taken over. Anyway, and William Hinton's mother was the one who founded the Putney School down in southern Vermont. So it's a really remarkable family. So there's a chapter on the Hintons and their family. There's Senator Ralph Flanders of Springfield, a conservative Republican businessman. One would have thought the last person to take on Senator McCarthy. And here he is serving some papers on Senator McCarthy and McCarthy's aide. Anybody recognize this fella? Roy Cohn. Now, anybody doubts the relevance of then to now, consider this fact. 25-year-old Roy Cohn was McCarthy's protege, and 50-year-old Roy Cohn was Donald Trump's mentor in Manhattan politics and society. Another event that I cover in my book was the firing of Professor Alex Novikov from the University of Vermont. This was Vermont's one high-profile academic firing. In state colleges, especially state colleges and universities all over the country, there was a massive purge of professors who had either been named by others as communist-leaning or had refused to testify in front of state or Senate committees. But Novikov was the one and only Vermont professor, and the governor at the time, Lee Emerson, put a lot of pressure on both UVM and its trustees and the legislature. Said, if you don't form a panel that recommends that this guy be fired, I am going to cut the funding to UVM for the next fiscal year. So a former professor at UVM, roughly my contemporary, wrote a definitive book on Novikov and this case. And that was actually the first hint that I got that I should be investigating this publisher and editor, Bun OShea, because in this book it talks about the concerted campaign by certain newspapers, mainly the Burlington Free Press, which is still around, and the Burlington Daily News, which is not. They ran many anti-Novikov editorials supporting the university in its decision to fire him. Only one newspaper in Vermont supported Novikov, and this was alluded to in this book by David Holmes, and that was Bun OShea, who ran this little newspaper called the Swanton Courier. And Holmes also quoted a letter to the editor in the Essex Junction, a paper that no longer exists, called the Suburban List. You remember the Suburban List? Oh, yeah. And did you know the editor, Milo Reynolds? No, not after, yeah. Anyway, Holmes quotes a letter to the editor of the Suburban List saying, Bun OShea at the Swanton Courier should not be taken seriously because, after all, he's educated in the Ivy League, and we can't believe those people. Anyway, so the name Bun OShea was familiar to me as somebody who, throughout the 70s and into the 80s, appeared on the various Democratic tickets. He was either running for governor or representative, even the Senate. But I didn't know that he was an editor and a publisher. And a lot of my research was done at the State Archives, which has just about any Vermont newspaper you can think of going back to the 19th century. But for some reason, I never did find out the reason. There was nothing for the Swanton Courier from 1925 to 1970. And so did a little digging, and didn't take much to connect with Ron Kilburn at the Swanton Historical Society. I thought Ron was going to be here today, but maybe the weather kept him away. And Ron said, well, we've got the entire press run of the years that Bernard O'Shea had the Swanton Courier. They're in the basement at the Swanton Library. So I can't tell you what a pleasure it was after all those hours of, I don't know how many of you have had experience with microfiche machines in the library, stiff neck, headache, you know, the whole works. I had an afternoon to sit at a round table and turn the pages of the Swanton Courier one by one. I had my trusty iPhone to take photos of editorials. And I realized here was another chapter in the making for my book. So the very youthful Bernard O'Shea, just out of curiosity, how many people here did meet him at one point? Okay. Did anybody actually work on the Enosburg paper, the Swan paper? That's a whole other story. Anyway, both Bernard O'Shea and his wife, Sheila Casey O'Shea, they met in the Navy. They were both Navy officers in World War II, and they came back from the war very, very moved and changed by what they had seen, and became very fervent Quakers. And this really, really affected their worldview. In 1949, the opportunity came to buy the Swanton Courier. At this point, O'Shea was the editor of the Berkshire Eagle in Massachusetts. He was a native of Northampton. Sheila was from Rouse's Point, right across the water here. And the two of them bought the paper in 1949. And one of their first editorials, the vitality and integrity of a newspaper is often the vitality and integrity of the community. It's cooperation that makes a weekly. They were saying, weekly newspapers cannot hope to compete in the fields of worldwide news, so they limit their activities to the very local home front. They do their best to keep the hometown folks informed. Well, this was true up to a point, because even though if you look at those Swanton Couriers, it looks like any other small town newspaper. 4-H club meeting, here's the select board meeting, here's new construction, here's the Little League scores, till you get to the editorial page. And then the focus got much bigger. And this was one of many editorials that O'Shea ran. Although Sheila O'Shea was nominally the editor and Bernard O'Shea the publisher, he was responsible for many of the editorials. You can't really read it from here, but it's called This Silly Hysteria, 1951. It had come to his attention from a newspaper in Madison, Wisconsin, that somebody had put the Bill of Rights on a clipboard and went to the main intersection in town and asked people to sign it, and nobody would. So it was a measure of how the Red Scare had affected people's civic engagement. So here's a editorial that is called Decision Without Conviction, and it's one of 4 or 5 that the O'Sheas wrote about Professor Novikov and the unfairness of his treatment at the hands of the trustees. And it was fear of loss of state funds and public attacks from the Reynolds and Loebs that caused university trustees as a body to take action in firing Dr. Novikov. Reynolds referring to Milo Reynolds of the Suburban List, and Loeb referring to William Loeb of the well, he was famous for being the Manchester Union Leader publisher, but one of the facts that I did not know before I started the research on this book was that Loeb got his start right here. The St. Albans Messenger was the first newspaper that he owned. He then moved from there to take over the Burlington Daily News, which provided him a much bigger megaphone. And then when he got tired of Vermont and the opportunity came to go to New Hampshire, whose politics were much more in keeping with his, he kind of left Vermont, and the Burlington Daily News kind of folded in 1955. Anyway, some of the O'Shea's favorite targets were Vermont's Congressman Charles Plumlee, who is a 6-term congressman. First, he was a state representative from Northfield, and he was a very strident anti-communist, anti-labor. Any kind of union activity was a sign of socialism for him. He was also against the rural electrification campaign. I couldn't quite understand his reasoning there. And then in his later years, Plumlee had a favorite hobby horse, which was that communist-tainted textbooks were being used in Vermont high schools. And the teachers' union should really do something about this, and the legislature should really do something about this. And by then, Plumlee had become sort of a figure of fun, and people did not take him quite as seriously. Not as seriously as they took William Loeb in New Hampshire. Loeb was another favorite target of the O'Sheas. And there was one interesting exchange. This happened in 1953, where the editorial in the St. Albans Messenger attacked the O'Sheas for being bleeding heart liberals. And the next week, the printing presses at the St. Albans Messenger broke down, and the O'Sheas offered their plant to the St. Albans Messenger, and says, it's incredible what a little bleeding heart liberalism can do for your fellow newspapermen. Another favorite target of the O'Sheas was Lewis Wyman, who was the Attorney General in New Hampshire. And one chapter of my book is devoted to really examining what the Vermont experience was like compared to the New Hampshire experience, largely because of the presence of Loeb. If you crossed Loeb, you got a front page editorial, signed editorial, attacking your patriotism. Lewis Wyman fancied himself a kind of McCarthy. He talked the New Hampshire legislature into giving him investigative powers, setting up a committee to investigate subversive activities like those who he imagined were happening at the University of New Hampshire, taking state funds in hiring suspect people to give lectures. So anyway, the O'Sheas kept very much abreast of what was happening in Vermont and in New Hampshire and running editorials. And every once in a while, Sheila O'Shea would have her own editorial. And one that really caught my eye was about how many trucks she was seeing going through St. Albans and Swanton with the Confederate flag on them. This was 1954, yeah. And then she wrote another really amazing editorial talking about the Alfred Kinsey report on human sexuality and how much there was to learn from this book. This at a time when a lot of libraries were banning it. But the O'Sheas, as I mentioned, were very affected by what they had seen in World War II. And this is where that editorial page of the Swanton Courier really separated itself from many other Vermont newspapers. It had a real internationalist slant. So 1953, Bun OShea wrote an editorial commemorating the, it was actually 1951, maybe. It was the, yes, 1951, the 6th anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bomb on Nagasaki. And he started this editorial saying, I'm going to reprint an editorial from Fellowship magazine. And Fellowship was the official magazine of a Quaker group called the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a pacifist group that was led by, not Dorothy Day, but A.J. Muste. And then every once in a while, you know how some papers will have headings of what other editors are saying. I still see that today in many newspapers. O'Shea would use that to highlight editorials written in the Saturday Review of Books by leading political scientists and pacifists. And every once in a while, something by the Catholic pacifist Dorothy Day, who ran the Quaker, I'll have to do something about that, the Catholic Worker Organization, and not somebody that people in Swanton would necessarily have heard about. When I spoke to the O'Shea's son, Kevin, in preparation for this book, Kevin said to me, I never could figure out who he thought his audience was. He just assumed that he was, you know, striking his note for world peace, and if anybody got the message, just fine. Another son of theirs, Chris O'Shea, who I just learned died this past fall, recalled walking with his parents down the street in Swanton and being accosted by people attacking them for lack of patriotism, and they came to take with them both of them their Navy discharge papers, and say, "You see this? I'm as good American as you are." So clearly, not everybody was in tune with the O'Sheas. So around 1956, Bun OShea took a very quixotic stand to run as a Democratic candidate against the enormously popular George Aiken. And knowing that he would be lucky to get 30% of the vote, but he felt that, you know, somebody had to do it. This was a democracy. And as much as he admired Aiken personally, he was one of the few editors and publishers in Vermont who was a proud Democrat. The rest of the Vermont papers went from very strident anti-communism like William Loeb to kind of middle-of-the-road republicanism at the Burlington Free Press to kind of Aiken Gibson supporting liberal Republicans like Robert Mitchell at the Rutland Herald and John Drysdale at the White River Valley Herald. But OShea was the one outspoken Democrat. And so he ran against Aiken and lost, but what I heard from his sons was that he just loved campaigning. He loved getting out there and meeting people. And he evidently had the personality that was very suited to this. In 1958, he finally found his candidate that he could really support. And this is a kind of a sadly forgotten figure in Vermont politics today. His name was William H. Meyer. And in 1958, he became the first Democratic U.S. representative from Vermont in 104 years. And this was the headline in the Swanton Courier. So the O'Sheas were big supporters of William Meyer, and in fact, in Meyer's 1960 campaign, Bun OShea became his campaign manager. And I had one of those great aha moments that any archivist or researcher lives for. The UVM special collections, there is all of William Meyer's papers, and there was like 32 boxes. And I said, to start with, I said, okay, well, just give me the one that says correspondence. And I'm going through, and there is this big, fat file folder that says OShea. And the letters back and forth about how to run the campaign, and you got to explain this better, Bill. People need a better explanation of why communist China should be admitted to the UN, or why we need nuclear disarmament, So he was very much at home in that political world. Sometime in the late 60s, the Swanton Courier the whole operation got moved over to Enosburg Falls. And there were about 5 or 6 papers, some of you may know this better than I, that got, it was under one roof, but a paper for Swanton, a paper for Enosburg, a paper for Richford, et cetera. And all the stories that I've heard, and this could be another great book, not going to be written by me, but somebody who is there. The atmosphere at this newspaper was evidently so open and welcoming. At this time, Bun and Sheila's son, Chris, had just come back from going to college at the University of North Carolina. And some of his friends had come back from the University of North Carolina. Oh, sure, there's a job at the newspaper. It's not going to pay much, but, And so many of the, quote, back to the landers wound up getting a job working for Bun OShea. And according to somebody I interviewed, Tyrone Shaw, who's now a professor of journalism at Johnson State, Tyrone was one of those lucky young people who got to breathe this atmosphere. And he said, yes, Bernie Sanders was even one of our journalists for about 2 months, and he quit because the atmosphere was too chaotic. So there's a story there. Anyway, sadly, Bun OShea died while attending a UN conference on world peace in 1988. He's remembered by many people in the Burlington area as, from his Quaker activities and from other peace activities. Anyway, that's just a little part of the book. I wanted to leave some time for questions. I can see that some of you actually may have lived through this era and maybe remember, like I do, watching my parents watching the Army McCarthy hearings on TV. Anyway, happy to get questions. John.
I've got a question, but I have a comment on it. I know my father was absolutely glued to the television set.
I'm having a little trouble hearing.
My father was absolutely glued to the television set in the McCarthy hearings.
Yeah. The McCarthy hearing, the Army McCarthy hearings of 1954, one of the people I interviewed was a longtime editorial page editor of the Rutland Herald, Kendall Wild. And he remembered, he said, you got to remember, TV did not really come to homes in Vermont till 55 or 56. And he could remember putting the Rutland Herald to bed, and the entire staff would go over to the one television set in Rutland at the big hotel there, whatever it was called, and watching that. Yes, so those hearings were in the spring of 1954, and McCarthy had been very weakened by those hearings because so many people who did have TVs got to see him up close and to see that he was a bully and a demagogue and thought nothing of sliming other people's reputations. So Flanders, this is one of the things that drove Senator Ralph Flanders to say now is the time to lead the movement to get McCarthy censured by the US Senate.
What was George Aiken's involvement at that time? I'm not a native Vermonter, but I know enough about it. The name Flanders came up immediately. I knew he was involved. Did Aiken?
Yeah, now this is a very interesting question. It involves Senator George Aiken, who was in the Senate from the late 40s straight through to the late 70s. In 1950, Senator Margaret Chase Smith, a Republican from Maine, she and Aiken and 4 other senators signed what they called the Declaration of Conscience, which got a lot of publicity at the time. But as I said, McCarthy came on the scene in February of 1950, and by the summer had been recognized by some people as somebody who had to be reckoned with. So Aiken was very out front about taking on McCarthy. But the funny thing is that when Flanders came along, it seemed as though Aiken's attitude was, be my guest, I'm going to get out of the way, you take the heat. For some reason, and it's never really been quite explained, Aiken decided not to get involved in Flanders' campaign to censure McCarthy. He did vote to censure McCarthy when the vote finally came up, but did so reluctantly. Yeah.
My father was born in 1911 and he's still living.
Whoa.
And he was assigned to take photographs of Will Durant in southern Vermont. He had a summer home in southern Vermont. And I don't know who assigned him to do this, but he was considered pink. He was and my father was given this assignment.
She was saying that her father was given an assignment to photograph the famous historian at the time, Will Durant. I still have my parents' copies of the 6-volume It's pretty heavy, history of civilization. But I didn't know that Will Durant had been considered left-wing and, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit more about censorship in schools, books, textbooks that were,
Yeah.
how deep was that here?
Well, Plumlee, the question involved that issue of censorship of the high school textbooks, which I mentioned earlier. It didn't go really further than Charles Plumlee, who is willing to give it as much publicity as he could possibly give it. But it turns out it boils down to one writer whose history books were used in Vermont classrooms. His name was Harold Rugg, R-U-G-G. And I guess he might be considered a little like the Howard Zinn of his day, that Plumlee really objected to the what he considered negative portrayal of the founding fathers, that they were slaveholders. And you know that Rugg was spotlighting certain darker corners of American history, and Plumlee took that as kind of disloyalty. So he made a few kind of jumps there that these books were being used, and that Rugg is a left-wing historian, and he's promoting this kind of worldview. So these books are communist tainted.
What was the reaction in the public sector with this? Did people go along with this and challenge teachers who were using this text?
No, actually, the Vermont NEA, or how it existed then, came out very strongly against it. You know, they had Plumlee made this speech at it was the end of his final term in Congress, and he was addressing the annual state Republican convention. And he's saying, and we've got to do something about these textbooks. And the next day, or a few days after that, the headline in the paper was, Vermont educators take issue with Plumlee. Never went anywhere. Plumlee retired, but a good friend of his and kind of a like-minded friend had taken over the seat as the representative to the legislature from Northfield. And through Plumlee, that person, I think his name is Charles Barber, he wangled an invitation to Plumlee to come and address a joint session of the Vermont legislature to alert them to this problem that was plaguing Vermont. And the legislature, which, got to remember, overwhelmingly Republican, said, I don't think so. So there's a big headline from the Burlington Free Press at the time, Assembly rebuffs Plumlee. And the editorials, not only in papers such as O'Shea's, but all over, were basically, you've earned your retirement, Uncle Charlie. Now, you know, there's the rocking chair over there, and, you know. Brant.
I'm sorry he's not here, but Richard Copperthwaite was one of those people who came north with Chris O'Shea from North Carolina School of Journalism.
Yeah, he's a real blue devil.
Yeah.
Yes.
He was just down there.
Yeah. Richard was somebody that I interviewed for the book, and he actually came to an event I did at the Eloquent Page across the street. So I did get to meet him finally, but clearly those people had such stories about, and evidently there was an enormous house where Bun OShea and his second wife lived in Enosburg Falls, And Denny was telling me about that. And a lot of the younger people lived there. And I don't know if it was Richard Cowperthwaite or one of the other people who would say, you know, a typical day would be, you know, Bun saying, well, it's too nice to go into the office. I'm going to go skiing. I'll see you at the office later. And noon would roll around and he would still be gathering up his ski equipment. And he said it was a pretty chaotic lifestyle. But I was saying to Brant before, the last time I was in St. Albans, right after my talk here, I went to interview Nat Warman, who has since passed away. And Nat had a lot of great stories about working with Bun, who he said he was a courageous, cool, brave person who, you know, took on a lot of issues that most people would rather not think about too much. Well.
Great question. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to be over here if anybody wants to look at the book, buy one. Happy to do that.